stop slipping, and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
This is a serious question and I want you to answer honestly. What would it take for you to buy a pair of Under Armour football boots? Because while they've definitely had their ups and downs, the current Magnetico being a great example of a fairly iffy product, the boots inside this box I genuinely think are really good, but unfortunately the vast majority will never even consider giving them a chance. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the limited edition, definitely not for Sunday League, Pitch Viper colorway of the Under Armour Shadow Elite 3. Limited to just 1,200 pairs worldwide, these boots very clearly feature a black and pink snakeskin pattern across the entire upper, with a chrome Under Armour logo on either side of the heel and a slightly blue tinted carbon fiber sole plate. Needless to say, this colorway certainly isn't going to be for everybody, but it definitely grabs your attention, something that I think Under Armour desperately needs to do to gain some type of traction in the football boot market, where normally this is a football boot that would retail for $220. However, this LE Pitch Viper variant retails for $10 more at $230, which obviously isn't cheap, but it is less expensive than what you're going to find from the more popular alternatives from brands like Nike, Adidas, and I guess you could even throw Puma into the mix. But let's be honest, being a little bit less expensive simply isn't good enough. Because we don't sugarcoat things around here, let's be real, at $230 or $220 for a normal colorway, why would you take a chance on these when you can go for a known commodity in Nike, Adidas, Puma? Even New Balance at this point I think has more of an established reputation in the football boot market over Under Armour. Well, that's the question that I hope to answer for you, specifically as it relates to the Shadow Elite 3s, because I do think they're really good football boots, particularly if you're looking for something with a knitted upper. Whether or not they're the best option though, that's what we'll have to discuss. So if you're interested in learning more, including how they fit and feel on feet, please stick around. And if you are interested in a pair for yourself, either in this crazy Pitch Viper colorway or one of the normal ones, you can pick these up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes by checking out the first link down below. And as always, if you enjoy the content, drop a like on the video. And if you appreciate the unsugar-coated, brutally honest, unsponsored reviews on this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. So if Under Armour expects us to pick the Shadow 3 Elite over everything else, we have to consider the other options, of which I would argue there are 4 main competitors with a knitted upper that offer the feel of a knitted upper. The Nike Mercurial in both the Vapor 16 and Superfly 10 Elite, the Nike Phantom GX2 and Luna 2 Elite, the New Balance Furon V8 Elite, and the New Balance Tequila V4 Plus Pro Low. The Nikes being more expensive than the Shadows, where the New Balances are very similar in price, but technically that little bit less expensive. However, both of the Nike options feature grip knit uppers, which means that they provide extra grip on the ball. So if that's what you're after, I definitely think those are the way to go. The Furon is definitely more of a speed boot, or at least a much thinner knitted upper than what you're going to get from the Under Armour. So if that's more your cup of tea, they would be the more obvious choice, leaving the Tequila V4 Plus Pro Low as realistically the only true alternative to the Shadow 3, where obviously the Tequilas aren't the most popular football boots on the market despite being really good. And as a direct comparison to the Shadow 3 Elite, I'd make the argument that they are very, very different, meaning that Under Armour with this particular product isn't really trying to copy anybody. And I think that's something that I've always appreciated about the Under Armour brand. But I think with that, because the average football boot consumer is so wrapped up in what the most popular boots are, if you don't make something at least a little bit similar, it becomes even more difficult for people to want them. Which sounds crazy because you think people would want something unique, especially if it's good, but in reality, reality, at least when it comes to football boots, that couldn't be further from the truth. Where if we look at the Shadow 3 from a technical perspective, they're pretty much as cool and high-tech as it gets, where obviously this Pitch Viper colorway has its own look, but if we look at the boot in one of the standard colorways, it does reveal all of that IntelliKnit that does get more exposed through the midfoot. Unfortunately, that's covered up because of the snakeskin polyurethane top layer on this particular colorway, but it has this really unique ridge texturing that does kind of relate these a little bit to the Superfly 5 from back in the day, which I think a lot of people have very fond memories of. I'd actually make the argument that this IntelliKnit upper feels better than the Superfly 5 in that it has a little bit more thickness to it, but also just is super soft while still maintaining a decent amount of structure. This has that really nice balance of softness and that sock-like feel that I think you expect from a fully knitted upper, but also with the laces tied tight, especially because they've kept the design relatively simple with the one-piece upper construction and central lacing system, that the boot still feels secure on your feet, wraps your foot very closely, but at the same time doesn't necessarily have that squeeze your foot sensation like so many speed boots seem to have these days, even though this does for the most part have a little bit more of that speed boot aesthetic. In other words, you can draw comparisons to other football boots, but at the end of the day, the Shadow 3 really does feel like its own unique product. If we move to the base, this is again where we're going to find an element that people have wanted Nike to bring back for such a long time now, but you can get it in 2025 for less than Nike ever offered it for in this carbon fiber sole plate, which granted isn't quite to the same extent as what you're going to find on, for example, the Puma Ultra 5 carbon, which again is a more expensive football boot, but I would argue a much better representation of what carbon fiber can actually do for the responsiveness of a sole plate. This, I would argue, feels more like a traditional plastic sole plate, but at the same time doesn't really stray too far away from what the carbon sole plate used to be from Nike. For example, the one on the Superfly 4 really doesn't feel that dissimilar to what you get on these. And then when you pair up that carbon tech with what is a very aggressive bladed stud pattern that is definitely more on the experimental side, this to me really reminds me of kind of the glory days of the Nike Mercurial series, where every generation had something a little bit different. The traction, the bite on firm natural grass is top notch, but because these have an Under Armour logo on the upper rather than a Nike swoosh, people are just a lot less excited to try something like this. Where don't get me wrong, it's not all positive, because for all of the speed boot qualities of the Shadow Elite 3, it's not overly lightweight, and perhaps more surprisingly, I found that there is a pretty significant weight difference between these two colorways, the normal one and the Pitch Viper, both in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the normal colorway on the scale, where you can see that they weigh in at 8 ounces exactly, the equivalent of 226 grams, which again, isn't heavy, but isn't overly lightweight for what is kind of more or less a top-end speed boot. And then if we throw on the Pitch Viper colorway, they weigh in at 9.1 ounces, the equivalent of 257 grams. How they've managed a 30-gram weight difference between colorways, I'm not entirely sure, but long story short, regardless of which one you go for, if you're expecting that kind of weightless sensation on your feet, especially from something that has a carbon fiber sole plate, not that these are heavy football boots, but they aren't necessarily super light either. The fit and feel on feet is one area where I think the Shadow Elite 3 would actually impress a lot of people, especially for those of you that are of the opinion that some football boots are just too narrow and feel too tight on your feet. This definitely has some extra width and volume that I would say the vast majority of the most popular football boots don't often have. Although I will say in this particular Pitch Viper colorway, compared to the normal one that has some of the more exposed IntelliKnit on the upper, these just have a little bit more of a structured, slightly stiffer sensation, but that is not to say that they are uncomfortable. I just think the normal colorways do fit and feel that little bit better, which is kind of unusual again, because usually we don't get a lot of comfort or fit variation from one colorway to the next. Regardless, this knitted upper I think strikes a really nice balance of softness and pliability, which is ultimately what gives the boot that sock-like sensation on your feet. But at the same time, with the laces tied tight, they have a decent amount of structure and feel very secure on your feet, making for that responsive sensation I think you should only expect from a top-end product. Of course, the carbon fiber sole plate and bladed stud pattern kind of implies that these are going to have a little bit more of a speed boot feel, and to a certain extent they do. Certainly the sole plate underfoot does have that responsive sensation, but if you're comparing these to, again, say a Nike Mercurial or even a New Balance Furon, to name a couple knitted speed boot alternatives, these feel quite a bit different and trend in the slightly more structured, dare I say, padded realm, where again, a better comparison from a thickness standpoint might be something along the lines of a Nike Phantom GX2. From a width and sizing perspective, they definitely have some decent width and volume to them, like I mentioned, where I think these are going to be suitable for the vast majority of people. Just keep in mind that the stretch across the top of the foot from that elasticated knit isn't anything crazy, so they still will have some tightness when it comes to putting the boots on and taking them off. So if you need extra width through the midfoot, it's something to be aware of, but like I said, they should work well for the vast majority. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, is the Under Armour Shadow Elite 3 a great pair of football boots? Absolutely, there is no question about that. But are you going to pick the Shadow Elite 3 over any other football boot that money can buy for in and around $220? For the vast majority, I think the answer to that question is probably not. Where let's be real, unless Under Armour goes out and literally spends tens of millions of dollars endorsing some of the best players in the world, the average consumer is not going to be interested in Under Armour football boots. But if they want the enthusiast community to embrace them, which I think ultimately should be their goal, they need to provide a product that does something better or different than everything else, ideally at a price tag that is much less expensive than the more popular alternatives. And while I think the Shadow 3 Elite is a great pair of football boots, unfortunately, it doesn't check enough of those boxes for people to take a chance on them unless they stumble across a pair for $100 at an outlet. At least that's my take.